happy to have the guests that we have on. Continuing on, I guess, with our end of the year episodes, we'd like to kind of sit back and be leisurely and
get some familiar faces.
Familiar faces, yeah.
Familiar
exactly.
voices.
Some strange familiar face and voice, yes. Mr. Timothy Renner, welcome back to Conspirinormal. It's I think it's been about a year since we had you on, actually. Oh, no, well, we did. I forget about the Strange Realities preview.
The Strange Realities promos, but yeah.
But this being like just like you by yourself type of thing. I think the last time we had you on was with Chad, I think.
Oh, yeah, talk about the Witch Cloud.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but you are coming up with projects just left and right. And I think you hit me up not too long ago about a new podcast that you're doing. You're doing another podcast.
Yes, I want to make this very clear. It's an addition to, not instead of, Strange Familiars. Strange Familiars is still the main thing. That's still happening, still on a regular release schedule. Nothing is changing with that.
Right. And this one is kind of a shorter bit of a format and a little bit of a different format than Strange Familiars. So I'll just let you talk about what you're doing.
Yeah. So I was reading all these Lives of the Saints, and particularly, but not exclusively, but particularly the medieval Lives of the Saints are really, really interesting, really, really cool. And there's a lot of crossover with folklore in there. And I have a lot of awesome stories. Like we've got one coming up on, I say we, I'm the only one doing this podcast. I got to get used to saying me when it's the Flowered Path. So the podcast is called The Flowered Path. It's about saints, but we have an episode coming up on what's called the Cephalophores, and these are all saints that are pictured holding their own head. So they've been beheaded, and they're pictured holding their head. So a lot of stories about them, picking up their head and walking 2 miles and preaching before they fall down, or one of the saints got their head cut off, and she carried it back to the local bishop, who was the one who converted her, and then fell at his doorstep and stuff. So really neat stuff like that you can believe or not believe, but they're really cool stories from these saints' lives. And as I was reading them, I was like, this would make cool Strange Familiars material, but also I don't want to hit people over the head with too much religious stuff on Strange Familiars. So I thought, well, I'll do a separate podcast since I'm reading about this stuff anyway. I wanted to do something with this information. So I thought, you know what? I'll start a new podcast, and that's The Flowered Path.
So what got you interested in reading that book?
I've been reading, I was reading about Marian apparitions for Strange Familiars, and the Lord's apparition, Saint Bernadette, she was sainted, and 2 of the 3 Fatima seers are sainted at this point. So I started reading about their lives because of these apparition shows we're doing over at Strange Familiars, and that just got me interested in saints in general. And I would just pick a saint, just when I had some free time. So I'm going to read about this one, and I started turning up these stories. It's just like, wow, this is so cool. The one of my favorites is the first saint I did was Saint Leonard, and that's how the podcast got its name. Really, really interesting medieval saint. He's kind of the patron saint of prisoners, and there's lots of really cool stories about prisoners invoking his intercession, and their chains would fall off of them, and they would hang their chains over his shrine or over his tomb, so as a sort of tribute to him. These broken chains. So his tomb was covered with these chains and stuff. But there's this other story about him, a place called St. Leonard's Wood in England, where there was a dragon. And supposedly he fought this dragon and got in a big bloody battle with it and ended up winning. He killed the dragon. They don't say how. They don't say what weapon he used. But he ends up killing the dragon, but he's wounded in the course of this. And everywhere a drop of blood fell, a white lily sprung up. Mm-hmm. So that's the title for the show came from that, The Flowered Path. As I figured as he's walking away, he's leaving this path of flowers behind him. I thought it was a pretty neat visual image, and then a great metaphor for saints in general.
And that's your first episode, right, on St. Leonard?
Yeah, St. Leonard, yep. Yep. So it's very fertile ground. There's just a lot of stuff. Like I said, if if people aren't religious, I think they could take it as folklore and just enjoy these stories as like cool folklore stories.
Right, right. I don't know how personal you want to go. We've talked about it a little bit on the last, like the Strange Realities preview episode, where you've kind of gone back to Catholicism.
Yeah, I was born and raised Catholic, and as you do when you get into punk rock and weirdo stuff, you step away from that. And I spent my years fiddling with various occult practices and so forth, and really in my 30s I really kind of came back to it, but I wasn't like really going back to church and stuff. I just was sort of reclaimed it. I would say I was culturally Catholic, but I hadn't really gone back to church on a regular basis. But just recently I've had a lot of sort of wonderful things in my life that I feel have pointed me back in that direction. And I thought, it's time to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So I've gone back to church, and I've made my first confession in something like 40 years. And
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you have a lot to confess?
Yeah, I'm not going into the specifics here,
Yeah.
but yeah, at some point the priest stopped me and just said, "Did you kill anybody?" I said, "No, I didn't kill anybody." He said, "All right."
He's like, is there anything I really need to know about?
Yeah, it was a long list. But it was also I'm finding meaning in this stuff. When I was a kid, I didn't get it, and it was I don't know if it was ever explained to me in the way it's been sort of these practices have been explained to me, or maybe I just didn't understand it, or I didn't want to give it time. But I didn't like it as a kid. I was just like, this is, but I realized, like I said, in my 30s, like, hey, there's something special here. And then, especially lately, I found that I'm really making a connection, and just these rituals mean a lot to me. And I don't want to evangelize or try to convince anybody. What I tell people is, hey, some things hum and some things don't hum, and I follow the things that hum, and this is really, really hums for me, and it's really kind of touching my heart in a wonderful way.
Well, I think when you explore and study the supernatural as much as, well, we all do, but you especially, Tim, I mean, doing Strange Familiars, writing the books that you have done, these other projects and your themes in your artwork, I feel like it's not so hard to embrace some of the supernatural aspects of a saint and the supernatural aspects of religion itself. So I heard Soraya not too long ago on his show talk about how you and Josh both used to be much more flesh and blood as far as Bigfoot goes, and much more materialist in that way. And you guys have, obviously with where the footprint's in, that's definitely there's a more supernatural thing to that. So just using that as an example, do you feel like since you've embraced that worldview more, that it's easier to embrace supernatural aspects?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm talking to people every week who I've, absolutely believe these people have been, very much affected by something unseen, something unusual, something, paranormal, if you want to call it that. And you just think about it, it's like, well, these saints, they're talking about things like levitation. They're talking about things like supernatural heaviness. They're too heavy to pick up. These things occur in paranormal accounts. They're talking about strange lights that followed them around. They're talking, these you get kind of the flip of the coin of the Bigfoot thing. So Bigfoot smells bad. People describe him as blacker than black, and he kind of leaves dead animals and excrement behind. And by the way, I'm not saying Bigfoot's a demon. I'm just using this as an example. Saints are kind of like the flip side of that. People say they're clothed in light. So instead of looking like a walking black hole, they seem like they're clothed in light. At least apparitions of saints, angels too. They give off a very good smell, which is by the way, one of the things that happened to me that kind of was a turning point for me, bringing me back to the church. I can get into that in a minute.
Yeah, please.
They give off a good smell. They, it seems like they bring this sort of opposite of everything that Bigfoot brings. And again, I'm not saying Bigfoot's a demon. I'm not going there. I'm just saying like it's kind of like the same sorts of phenomena, just kind of like the flip side of the coin to it. So it's like, is it that hard to believe when you get an unknown smell with Bigfoot that smells bad that you would get an unknown smell with these things that smells good? It seems like, as Brother Richard says, it's using the same channels. Whatever it is, it's using the same channels to get through.
The same kind of mysticism that you're recognizing in that. And in these stories about the saints, you have both supernatural phenomenon like these types you're talking about, but then also, like you mentioned, places being tied to the saints. And that seems to resonate with some of your mysticism that you already had, as far as these places are dedicated where these things supposedly happen, and they have recurring phenomenon, just like all this other stuff you study.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whether they're saints, graves, sometimes, the recent episode, St. Gabriel, like deaf people were just taking dirt from his grave and put it in their ear and they could hear again, or rubbing in their eyes if they were blind and they could see again, or just places they walked. He stayed in this cave, not Gabriel, but other saints have stayed in this cave or whatever, and they become these sort of places of pilgrimage sometime where people go there and miracles continue to happen. So yeah, places are very important. To take a step back, I want to push back a little bit because I heard Soraya say that. He likes to frame that I was a total flesh and blood guy. You can read in my first book, before I ever went on Where Did the Road Go? In my first book, I acknowledged there's something weird about Bigfoot. It's not just a normal animal. So yes, Soraya was probably further along that path than I did, and he might have helped me take a few steps in that direction. But I would like to say I was on my way there already.
We're going to set the record straight on Conspirinormal. Soraya said, "Oh, where did the road go?" Okay.
I love Soraya, but I do go back to my first book, Soraya. You will find I mentioned there's weird stuff about Bigfoot in my very first book.
Yeah. So what was the experience that you had with the good smell?
Yeah. So there's a really, really wonderful Marian apparition account from Spain in the 1960s called Garabandal. That's the town in Spain where it was happening. And I talk about paranormal phenomena. I'm going to do, I'm probably going to write a book on this, but I'm going to do a show on this upcoming, and I'll get into it. There's so much going on there. It makes Mothman prophecies look boring.
Are you doing the book on this particular case or on Marian apparitions in total?
I'm doing a book on Garabandal, basically like a paranormalist look at it. There's been a ton of Catholic people that have looked at it, but I'm going to look at it as paranormal phenomenon, and break it down in that way. Hopefully in a respectful way to the visions. This incident has not been approved by the Catholic Church, by the way. Some visions are approved and some aren't. There's a whole process to the approval, just like kind of the process to someone being sainted. And there's lots of visions that have been approved, and this one is just kind of in limbo. The Catholic Church is just kind of wait and see things. There's a lot of predictions have been made by the apparitions, and they want to see what happens. But in any case, the seers were offering religious items up to the apparition of the Virgin Mary to kiss, and she would kiss these items and give them back, and she said these are to be distributed throughout the world. Rosaries, crucifixes, and at some point they started giving her missals, so whole big books. And then they would take these books and they would just cut them into little pieces and put them in saint medals and send them all over the world. Mm-hmm. And I acquired one of these that the Virgin Mary had kissed, one of these relics, a medal, and it came in the mail. And Allison had her back to me. Now Allison's a agnostic at best. She's not on this journey back to Catholicism with me, and that's fine.
Was she raised Catholic too?
No. She was raised atheist.
Gotcha.
So, but that's fine. She's gives me the freedom to believe and do as I want as far as that goes, and likewise I give it to her. She doesn't have to believe what I believe. But again, she's a non-believer. She's got her back to me washing dishes at the sink. I had just gotten the mail. I tear open the envelope, and the room is immediately filled with the smell of roses. Absolutely, just boom, the whole room just fills up with the smell of roses. And Allison, with her back to me, says, "Whoa, roses." And if you know anything about the Virgin Mary apparitions, roses are, one of the things that, well, they're one of the flowers that's associated with the Virgin Mary. They call her the thornless rose. But these smells, these sort of flowery smells and stuff are very much associated with her. So that was a really powerful moment for me. I was like, whoa, this is really huge. And that was one of the things that's like, hey, I'm kind of being pointed back here, I think. Like there's too much going on, too many taps on the shoulder to just start ignoring this stuff.
Wow. Yeah, I've noticed you're going to do a lot about the Marian apparitions, because you had that two-parter with Brother Richard about Fatima, which was fascinating, by the way.
Next up is Knock and one other one. We're going to combine them into one show, I think. And then down the road, I'm going to get into Garabandal, which is my absolute favorite. I just absolutely love it.
Yeah, just as an aside, I mean, I there are some that we talked to Vincent Treewell about one that, well, supposed Marian apparition that happened in Wisconsin. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But there are some that...
A really old one.
Yeah, this was sometime, I think, in the 50s, maybe.
Oh, okay, because there's a I think an old one, like in the 1800s there too. But I think I know the one you're talking about. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's some that the church are just kind of like very against, and there's some that I guess that, well, obviously the ones that they recognize, and then there's obviously the ones that they are kind of wait and see. I mean, what's kind of some of that criteria is that where they say, okay, this is a real Marian apparition. This is the Virgin Mary. So, I mean, this seems like it's a very slow process, but I don't know how long did it take for Fatima? I mean, was it like 30 years?
Something like that. I think it was maybe in the 40s or 50s before they finally said, okay,
right,
we're good with this. Because predictions are made, and obviously if predictions are made and they don't come true, the church doesn't want to stand behind it, It's odd because some of these, there's healings that have taken place, right? And there's conversions that have taken place, and there's kind of wonderful things that have taken place, but the church is still hands off because there's these predictions that have been made. So, I'm guessing they don't want to be caught, approving something, and then down the line, whatever this prediction is doesn't come true, and then they look like, well, what happened. And I honestly wrestle with that as well, because there are some very specific predictions that were made as regards to Garabandal that need to happen in the seer's lifetime, and they are getting older. I think the main seer is in her 70s now. So
what are some of those?
Yeah.
There's supposed to be a revelation that everyone in the world receives. Basically they say you'll know it when it happens. And they said if you don't want to believe, you're like, anybody who doesn't want to believe is never going to believe it. But basically it's calling each person to account. And they said you will know when it happens. So everyone in the world is supposed to receive that. And then there's supposed to be a sign that happens on the mountain there at Garabandal that's a permanent sign that stays until the end of time, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So there's a big sign that's supposed to happen there. And then if people don't straighten up and kind of straighten out, there's supposed to be a big punishment that happens. So there's three things. And I think the first one, the mental warning or whatever that they call it, the call to account or whatever you would call that, is supposed to happen a short time before the sign, and then the punishment happens, I think, a year after the sign if people don't straighten up. So, but these are supposed to happen within a year of the main seer's, or I mean within the main seer's lifetime, not within a year, but sometime within her lifetime. And like I said, she's in her 70s now, so if it doesn't happen, I don't think the church is ever going to approve it.
And we talked a little bit before we started recording about how things are much more formal, bureaucratic process now to accept saints as well.
Yeah.
And in the past, these were more informal developments of folklore and these folk saints.
Yeah, like I said, they were kind of grandfathered in. These older saints, these like medieval saints, a lot of them, you know, if you were martyred and somebody remembered you, you're almost certainly a saint, you know, that's a way to almost instant sainthood. A lot of these things, like if they have, you know, people remember them doing miracles or maybe healing people or something, and they would just start being called a saint. And at some point they were just sort of, like I said, grandfathered in, but I don't know when, you know, I should have looked this up honestly before I talked to you guys, but at some point the church is like, no, we need to formalize this process. So then at a point it's like, no, okay, we need a certain number of miracles. We need, you know, this, and this, and a bunch of proofs before someone is officially canonized as a saint.
Right. And of course you've got like the apostles, you know, obviously those are, you know, already kind of grandfathered in, and that I think some of the Old Testament prophets are in there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wikipedia's, you know, of course, has a pretty comprehensive list of Marian apparitions, and it'll show what the category is and how the Catholic Church comes down on them.
Mm-hmm.
And full total approval by the Roman Catholic Church, there's only 6.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's some other categories in here that I won't go into, but like full absolute approval that it's what it says, that's endorsed by the Vatican, by the Holy See. 6 of them that are deemed worthy of belief.
But like with the saints, these become a part of people's practices regardless of the official church approval.
That's me, like, you know, sitting back here with this, you know, I'm wearing that medal from Garbandal right now. I wear it every day, and it means so much to me, and what happened means so much to me. And what do I do with that information if at some point the church says, nah, this isn't approved? You know, I don't think it necessarily means, it's kind of like folk saints, I think. So the folk saints are, they will not necessarily, like, and we're not talking about like Santa Muerte, which is a little bit different. That's a little bit more darker and more occult. But in general, like folk saints, like, you know, some guy like Saint John Billingsley or whatever, the guy who lived down the road, that, you know, people have decided that is a saint, you know, back 200 years ago or something. They're still saints. They're just not canonized saints, right? So they're still saints, and technically we are all saints. If, you know, just when we get to heaven, that's when we become a saint. But there's these canonized saints. So I'm guessing that I would take it like that. I would take it as like a folk apparition in the same sense as, like, it's not necessarily approved, but like there's been good stuff has happened there. There's been healings. There's been, you know, like I said, there's been conversions. There's been wonderful kind of things that have happened as a result of that, but it may never get approved. So, you know, it's an interesting place to be. For a while, priests weren't even allowed to visit Garbandal. Now they've relaxed that. Now priests are allowed to go, and people do pilgrimages there and stuff. They've relaxed that a lot. But I think throughout the 70s, the priests, the Catholic Church said, no, don't even visit there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just as an aside too, we're talking about the process of canonization and how that, it looks like it was a slow process through the Middle Ages. And I think by like the 17th century, it was fully like the Pope had to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's kind of a slow process over the course of a few hundred years
of developing a formal system.
Yeah, like bishops were basically doing their own canonizations.
That makes sense.
There was some problem with that, because apparently it said something like, so decretal of 1173, Pope Alexander III reprimanded some bishops for permitting veneration of a man who was merely killed while intoxicated. Prohibited veneration of the man, and most significantly decreed that you shall not therefore presume to honor him in the future. So, and he said, you know, it's not lawful for you to venerate him as a saint without the authority of the Catholic Church. So it's kind of the start of this kind of long process, to where it's, you know, the Pope has to make that decree only. Yeah.
But I think generally, like all the Celtic saints and stuff, they were all like grandfathered in.
Right.
Medieval saints and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. But returning to the podcast, The Flowered Path, how are you choosing who you want to talk about?
Completely randomly. It's absolutely, it's like whatever catches my attention. The first two were just, the Saint Leonard. I knew I wanted to do him first because that's how I chose the name for the podcast. Saint Agatha was the second one. There's a text called the Golden Legend. It's just a medieval Lives of the Saints kind of thing. And I literally just chose her at random. So that's a cool story. So I did her second. The next two, had a commission to do a piece of artwork, an icon of Saint Gemma Galgani, and Saint Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows, who was episode 3. He kind of comes about 50 years before her. He dies about 50 years before she's born, but he plays this very important part in her story. So I thought, before I do her story, I'm going to do his story. So it was kind of a method to my madness with that. So I did him, and then her. Basically, I did her because I was doing this commissioned artwork of her, and I had to study her anyway. So I thought, well, I'll do Saint Gemma, and then the Cephalophores will probably be next. That hasn't come out yet. The Headless Saints, and that was just I stumbled upon a story of one of these Headless Saints. Like, that is a cool story, and then I realized there's a whole category of them. So I just did a whole episode on various Headless Saints.
Do you have your illustrations for those yet?
Not yet.
Okay, that's going to be cool.
Yeah, I'm doing. That's the other thing. I'm trying to do an illustration for each saint as I go along here.
And as far as like a little bit about canonization and the difference between sainthood and, was it blessed or beatification?
Yeah, beatification. Yeah,
beatification. What's some of the criterias for someone to be declared a saint?
As far as I know, you need, to have lived an exemplary life, and you need a certain number of miracles. I think it's 3 confirmed miracles, what they call. Now, how do you confirm a miracle? I don't know. But if it's by location, I suppose, you have people in each location say, oh yeah, no, I saw this person at the same time. But other than that, you have people's testimony. I was miraculously healed after, praying to this person, or this person, if they were still alive, laid hands on me and healed me or something. So you need a certain number of miracles. I think it's 3 confirmed miracles. And then the church will look into their lives very thoroughly, and they will take their time doing it. And eventually, they'll determine one way or another, okay, this person is worthy. I think it used to take like a long, long time, but it's like Pope John Paul II was canonized very quickly. I guess, they had plenty of information on him, having been the Pope.
I've noticed something in looking at this, because listening to the podcast kind of spurred a little bit of an interest in this, and I've looked at this before, that there's some, I think Francis, he made 800 and something people, from some battle in, I think in Italy in the 1400s or something, and he made these people 800 of them into saints. So he's sainted 800 something people, but 819 of them were from this particular battle. I thought that was pretty interesting, that there's a group. I think John Paul II, I think he sainted these people that died in a revolt in Mexico in the 1920s. The government was anti-clericalist, and they executed a lot of people, and some of these people had been sainted as well. But what does it mean when someone is beatified? What does that mean?
That's the one step from sainthood, I believe. So you're venerable, you're beatified, and then it just means you're on the path, you're on the next step, and then the church will eventually, I guess, decide either way, because there's some people who've been venerable or beatified for 200 years. They've just not been canonized yet. But some people, again, it happens, like I said, with the Pope St. John Paul II, it happened pretty quickly.
Yeah, all very interesting stuff. Let's talk a little bit about some of the saints that you've already talked about.
Sure.
You've done 4 as of this recording. There may be an episode out when we put this out next week. But you've done 4 episodes of this so far.
Yeah.
And we can just start with Saint Leonard. We talked a little bit about him with the dragon aspect.
He was a disciple of Saint Remigius, and these are all like really early guys as far as in the European Church. They converted King Clovis, who was one of these very early like Frankish kings, one of the first like Frankish kings, I think, if not the first to be converted to Christianity. And it was him that gave Leonard, he promised to Leonard, he said, every prisoner you visit can be released. So that's what kind of started him as these patron saint to prisoners.
He's usually depicted with chains.
Yeah, broken chains or chains. He kind of went to become a hermit in the forest of Limousin in France, and he would preach in the Aquitaine there. Started gathering followers that would come just to be around him. Eventually, it kind of turns into a monastery. There's a story about him roaming through the woods in Limousin, and King Clovis was there hunting, and his wife went into labor. So when these old kings would go hunting, it was like they would take the whole court with them, and they often had these huge hunting lodges and stuff in the woods. So they would just take the whole court with them and take their wives and everything else, and they'd go out hunting and come back to the lodge or whatever. Well, and while she's in this lodge, this queen goes into labor, and St. Leonard he's walking through the forest, and he hears these cries. She'd been in labor, I think, for days, they said at this point. And he comes in, and the king says, "Who are you?" Didn't recognize him. He says, I'm a disciple of Remigius. And the king thinks, well, maybe this guy can help. So he goes and prays over, and the child's delivered. And King Clovis says to him, like, I will give you gold, I'll give you silver, I'll give you this whole forest, whatever you want. And St. Leonard just says, just give me as much land as I can ride around at night on my donkey. So the king says, go for it. So he hops on his donkey, rides around, and then this turns into a community, the Abbey of Noblat. He establishes a monastery there. And it's after this that these prisoners start invoking his name. And like I said, their chains would break, and they'd bring the chains to his tomb, and when he died, otherwise they'd bring it to the church there, and they'd lay these chains at the church, or after he died, they'd lay him over his tomb, and he became this patron saint of prisoners. And there's all these wonderful stories of prisoners, invoking him, his intercession, and their chains just falling off, or the prison doors just opening, and they can just walk out, and the guards are either put asleep, or something happens to the guards. They run away in fear. Sometimes Saint Leonard would appear in apparition form, and the guards would run away in fear, and these guys would just walk out of prison. So he's this kind of really wonderful patron saint of prisoners.
Do you know if that continues? The veneration among prisoners continues to this day?
I mean, he's still the patron saint of prisoners. So I would imagine, if you're Catholic and if you're in prison, that's the guy. I would think probably he's the one you're praying for his intercession. I would think he was a very popular saint in the Middle Ages. He kind of waned in popularity. Over time, your Saint Teresa's and your Saint Francis's, tend to pop up and overtake these older medieval saints. But there's still places all over the world named after Saint Leonard. I think there's a town in Maryland called Saint Leonard. So for a time he was super popular.
The idea of being a patron saint of something, is that just is that around some of these stories that are about these particular saints of kind of some of their aspects of their lives?
Yeah, it's usually something like, if a saint, loses an eye or something, he might become the patron saint of the blind. But also it's, people have found it effective to ask for their intercession for these things. So they found some of these guys would, sailors would invoke them. They weren't necessarily, sailors themselves, but for whatever reason, sailors would invoke their name, if there was a bad storm, and I guess they found it worked. So it became a thing. So, whatever the saint would become the patron saint against, storms at sea or something. So sometimes it's a matter of like, people have found this effective. Often it's something that's reflected in their life. Like, so for Saint Leonard, as King Clovis told him he could release any prisoner he saw, I think it's an easy step from there to making him the patron saint of prisoners.
And you go beyond even like the saints' lives to talk about people that have been affected by appealing to the saint. And I think in that episode you even talk about a couple of people that were released from prison because they invoked Saint Leonard.
Yeah, I don't know. Like in the later saints, we actually have people's names and so forth. And I'm just they just said like there was a nobleman who had a
Right.
dungeon in his tower, and he captured one of Saint Leonard's disciples. So there's no names given, but they said like he was chained to a pillar, and they kept completely in the dark. And they said, I think they said everyone who was put in this dungeon like died twice. Essentially, it's a horrible place to be. But Saint Leonard appears to them in an apparition, says, "Fear not, you will not die. Arise up and bear thou this chain with me to my church. Follow me." So he stands up, his chains break, and he follows this apparition out of the dungeon and onto the church, and adds his chain to the many that were there. So in these older accounts, you don't necessarily get names. In some of the newer ones, that like the saints from the 1800s, you actually get, this is this person's name, this is where they lived, this is what was cured. So that happens with the later saints.
I know a lot of Protestants might see it differently, but having a whole set of symbolism and this intermediary thing to focus a specific, result or petition towards a higher power on is very useful to people. So when you have these particular situations and saints that go along with them, just from like a spiritual technology perspective,
Yeah, I mean, I can do the whole Catholic apologetics thing and argue this from a religious perspective, but let's not, and let's just say, look at it like this, like take the Virgin Mary, for instance. You guys worship the Virgin Mary. Well, no, we don't. We ask for her intercession. And the way I would put it is, say you have your best friend and you would like to ask a favor from him, and you have a good relationship with his mom, and maybe your friend is a little bit resistant to that favor. You might go to his mom and say, "Hey, can you ask him, my friend here, to help me with this effort?" And it's very much like that. So it's like asking friends for help, asking people who've already died for their prayers. So yeah, it's. I realize, a lot of people say, "Wow, it's paganism." It's not, but I can see where people would come to that conclusion. Like I said, I'm not going to do the whole apologetics thing.
Definitely don't expect you to do that. But there's a certain accessibility too, in that these are people who had human stories and troubles and hardships, and for someone who's like critical of Christianity, you can see that maybe like a Christ figure or at the top of the Godhead might feel a little too holy, and like these are like actual human beings with stories that are really relatable. So it's a pretty good access point.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Absolutely. And even some of these later saints who we have like real detailed accounts of their lives, they're not perfect. They
weren't saints on their way to sainthood.
Yeah, I mean they've made some mistakes, and they did some pretty rough things sometimes. But sometimes it's about that turnaround, and sometimes it's about just recognizing, hey, people are imperfect. You tend to lose some of that with some of the medieval saints. Everything they did was wonderful, but in some of the more modern saints, it's like, people knew them and people remembered them, and they will say like, they weren't very kind about this, or in this one instance they weren't very kind, and you get that real human element where you go, well, wow, this was a person, and yet they still did these amazing things and so forth. So yeah, I think it's very accessible in that.
So let's talk a little bit about Saint Agatha. Now, she, in this one, you chose like this is early Christianity. This is early Christian martyr.
Yeah, 231 was the year she was born. This is during the Decian persecution rather. Emperor Decius in the year 250. He institutes this law that basically says everybody in the Roman Empire has to perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods, except Jewish people. For some reason, he He said Jewish people didn't have to do this, but everyone else, he said, you have to perform a sacrifice. And they even had certificates. They would give people signed certificates saying you've completed this sacrifice, and basically said you worship the Roman gods. They even have the wording to part of the certificate. It says, I have sacrificed to the gods all my life, and now again, in accordance with the decree and in your presence, I have made sacrifice and poured a libation and partaken of the sacred victims. I request you certify this below. So these Roman officials would actually certify these accounts. Of course, early Christians were very much at odds with this. They weren't going to do that, and that led to what they call the Decian persecution, which a lot of people got killed, including Pope Fabian was tortured and killed during that. So Agatha's in the middle of this, and she gets called. She was in an area of Italy called Campania, and she was called by a man named Quintianus. One thing I did bad for myself, I got myself into a world of pronunciation woes with this podcast.
Yeah, I bet.
It's Latin, it's French, it's Old English, it's all over the place with these saints, and I'm doing my best.
This is what I hear a lot from history podcasters is needing to learn pronunciations. So.
Yeah, and like my best friend Prevlin, the guy in Stone Breath with me, he's a absolute language master. He worked on the Oxford Book of Medieval Latin and knows I don't know how many Celtic languages and stuff. So I'm just I know he's listening. I know he's just shaking his head going, Tim, that's not how you say that. I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best anyway. So anyway, the governor of that area, his name was Quintianus. And he has Agatha brought before him. And they think he was probably just going to use this decree to take her land because she came from a rich Christian family. And well, okay, I can get her possessions. I can get her land.
Opportunistic type of thing.
Yeah. She's not going to do this. He knows that these Christians aren't going to sign this decree. They're not going to make these sacrifices. So he's like, well, I'll be able to just take her property. But supposedly when he saw her, he's struck with her beauty, and he's like, oh, I'm going to, I want her. So he makes these advances on her. She refuses. He ends up sending her to a brothel. At the brothel, she will not work. She will not prostitute herself, and she's completely unyielding. So they send her back to Quintianus. And let's see. She has these wonderful comebacks to him. I'm looking for one. Okay, so she refuses to become a prostitute. She refuses to yield to Quintianus' demands, and she says, "My courage and my thought be so firmly founded upon the stone of Jesus Christ that no pain may change it. Your words be but wind, your promises be but rain, your menaces be as rivers that pass. No matter how much all these things hurtle at the foundation of my courage, it shall not move." So then he starts to, warn her that he's going to torture her. He threatens her, and she refuses to make the offerings, refuses to pray to the pagan gods, and he throws her in prison, brings her out again, says, "How is your health?" She says, "Christ is my health." And he replies, "Deny Christ, by which you may escape your torments." And she comes back, says, "Nope, deny your idols of stone and wood and adore your maker who made heaven and earth. If you do not, you shall be tormented in the perpetual fire of hell." He doesn't like that, has her stretched on a rack and whipped, burnt with torches, torn with iron hooks. It's a really brutal story. Her story is really, really brutal. And he says, "Refuse your vain opinions and you shall be eased of your pain." And she refuses to yield again. And then he crushes her breasts. I don't know how, I'm guessing with heavy stones, and then cuts them from her body. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. And she just says, "Cruel man, have you forgotten your mother and the breast that nourished you, that you dare mutilate me this way?" So she doesn't have a super pretty story here, but she doesn't give in. She stands up to him and ends up being thrown in prison. And she has an apparition that comes to her and heals her, which she believes was St. Peter that came and healed her. and she ends up being she once again, he brings her out of the prison. He sees she's healed. He's like, he had forbid any doctors or anybody to go to her. And he says, how did you heal? How were you healed? And she basically says, well, God healed me. So then he throws her on coals and back into prison. She eventually just like, I had enough. She's been tortured essentially to death. She dies in prison, but she becomes the patron saint of breast cancer, obviously for those reasons. Rape victims, against fire, against earthquakes, patron saint of nurses, of bell founders. For some reason, I don't know why people make bells, but that's that. Torture victims, Sicily, Palermo, Malta, and natural disasters. So she gets a lot of patronage there. But yeah, her veil was supposedly they would march around the town when there was threats of volcanoes or earthquakes, and they said her veil would stop, just stop these storms and earthquakes and stuff in their path.
I think you mentioned this in that episode. There's an interesting tradition with this, like these pastries.
Oh yeah. So I was looking at I'm looking at the artwork and like, for inspiration and stuff. How am I going to portray her? And the medieval images of her have basically she's holding her cut off breasts on a plate, and it's so like, I don't know. There's something about that that's so kind of like, ugh, to me.
Yeah.
Like I don't want to draw that. But they said in medieval times they didn't know what those images were. They didn't know what she was carrying, and they thought it was loaves of bread. So there's this tradition comes of blessing loaves of bread on St. Agatha's feast day. So people will bring 2 loaves of bread on a plate, essentially, to the priest, and he will bless the bread. And they think it comes from those icons of her that showed her, holding her own breasts, and people just didn't know what she was holding on those plates.
Could you explain a little bit about the feast day concept? Because this is apparently very important in the calendar.
Yeah, it's a date. It's often their birthday if we know it, or the day they were martyred if we know it, or the day they died. And it is the day that we observe these saints' lives. It's not a feast as in a meal. It's just a feast as a celebration day. So it's, how they choose them. Like I said, sometimes it's their birthday, sometimes it's their death day. I don't know exactly how they choose them, but that's essentially all it is. That's when we celebrate these different saints, and you'll have, sometimes 5 or 10 on a day. If you look at like Butler's Lives of the Saints, it's a very popular book on saints. There's 5 or 10 saints for some days. That's
what I was going to ask, whether it's like it overlaps.
It'll be like, if you're a saint that shares St. Francis feast day, you're probably not going to get much attention,
Something to caught my eye in the article here about Agatha. It said it's a translation of her relics. Do you know what that means?
Where they were taken, usually?
Is commemorated on 10th March and 17th August, and that's August 17th. That's my birthday. Just throwing it out there.
There you go. Yeah, that
probably means nothing. But.
It's maybe when her relics were taken from her place of burial and taken to some church or another. There was a big market for relics in the Middle Ages. Yeah. Huge. They even fought, like some of these towns would end up fighting battles against each other for possession of these relics. Because, if you had, it's like tourists, if you had the relics in your church, people would come, they would make pilgrimage to the church in your town and, bring money with them and so forth. So there was, it was business in the Middle Ages, unfortunately. And they got into some pretty pitched battles over some of these relics sometimes.
Yeah, there were a lot of pieces of the true cross.
Yes, and I always thought, so I had heard, before I knew how this worked, I had heard, if you had put all the so-called pieces of the true cross together, you could make something like, 50 or 100 crosses, and there's way too many. But it was explained to me by Brother Richard that there's a specific ritual in the Catholic Church that when you touch, you can make a relic that looks just like another relic, and you can touch them together, and you do this ritual, and you're essentially saying, this is that relic now. This has all the attributes of that relic. You make it look the same. You touch them, you do this ritual, and that's how there's so many pieces of the true cross. That's how that happens.
Oh, okay. It's like a transubstantiation.
Yeah, it's like tag, you're it.
It's a transference of power.
Hmm.
basically. That's interesting.
There's yeah, I always liken it to a game my friend told me he played when he was little. It didn't have a very nice name. We'll call it a poopy stick. And basically, if you had a stick that you stuck it in cat poo, but anything that stick touched was essentially that forever tainted with with cat poo. So
Right.
it's kind of like the nice version of the poopy stick.
So the next two, I believe, really kind of go together, and you mentioned this. This is Saint Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows,
Mm-hmm.
and Gemma
Galgani, yeah.
Gemma Galgani. That one was particularly interesting. But let's talk about Saint Gabriel, because with this we're kind of getting, there's this order that comes up in both of these called the Passionists.
Mm-hmm.
And we could explain kind of what that is too. There's all these different orders and of monks and nuns, and
Yeah,
it gets
I
a
forget
little confusing.
who the saint was that established the Passionists, but they're a order that is particularly dedicated to the passion of Christ, essentially the crucifixion and the pains he suffered during crucifixion and of course the resurrection. And I forget the saint that established that order, but yeah, they're
Hall of the Cross is what this says.
all of the cross. So you have your Franciscans, you have your Passionists. These are just different sort of orders within the Catholic Church that have certain areas of specialism, I guess you would say, and different areas of interest and so forth. The Passionists were known, at least back then, were known to be a particularly kind of extreme sect. They were how to put it, kind of very strict in their beliefs and in their orders and so forth. So if you were a Passionist, that was a pretty rough row to hoe, at least back then. I'm not sure how they are now. Pretty serious way. It's like now we have there's a Carmelite monastery for Carmelite nuns not far from here. They're building a stone monastery in the fashion of these old European monasteries. There's a very cool documentary on it on YouTube. I think it's called "To Last 1,000 Years," and you can see them. They're just building this place, and they want it to last 1,000 years. But they're a good example. They're decalcified, so they don't wear shoes. They don't have any modern conveniences. They have wood heating. They grow all their own food and so forth. And this is today, so you can imagine some of these orders back in the 1800s when this was. So Francesco Possenti, he becomes Saint Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. He's born Francesco Possenti. He's actually baptized in the same baptismal font that Saint Francis of Assisi was christened in. So he kind of has that going for him from birth. But he's growing up in Italy in the mid 1800s. So he's born 1838. And he is called from a very early age to be religious, as a religious, as they say, to be a priest or a monk. And he's known as a good student, but he's also known as very vain. So he's very into nice clothes and looking nice. And at one point, he's engaged to two different women at the same time. He's very appreciated by the fair sex. He got this nickname called the Dancer. So he's very kind of out there in the world. He lives this before he becomes religious, he lives a pretty worldly life. At the age of 14, he becomes seriously ill, and he prayed for the intercession of the Blessed Virgin. He says, if you cure me, I promise I'll join a religious order. Please cure me, please cure me, please cure me. How much have we heard this before? He's cured, and he's like, well, I'm okay now, and he goes on about his life. Then he's on a hunting expedition. He's narrowly missed by a bullet, which scares him, and he renews this promise. He says, okay, I promise I'm gonna join a religious order. And then soon enough, back to the secular world, he forgets. He's a teenager at this point. Who can blame him, right? You want to have fun. At 16, he's afflicted with a throat abscess, which is caused this severe inflammation in his throat. And one night he can hardly breathe. He's like, his throat's closing up. And he remembers this. He has a picture of St. Andrew Bobola that's given to him by one of his teachers. He wraps that image around his neck and prays for the saint's intercession. And that night, he falls asleep. Just falls into an easy slumber. Wakes up in the morning, he can breathe. He says the inflammation is almost completely gone. He's able to breathe easily. On the picture, this saint is like this little stain that he thought was some kind of indication of, like, I don't know if he felt it was whatever was being drawn out of him, but he noted that there's a stain on the picture and he felt better, like an indication of the favor granted. He applies to the Jesuit order at this time. He's like, okay, but he's accepted and then delays his promise. He says, well, some other time. So his brother dies. His other brother commits suicide. In 1855, there's a cholera outbreak in Spoleto. It's the town he's living in at the time, which claims the life of his older sister. And the cathedral there had this icon of the Virgin Mary that they turned out in the loggia. It's the part of the cathedral that faces out. And they put it facing the city square. And they said as soon as they put this icon out, there's no more cases of cholera. And the people that remained sick were supposedly cured at this point. So they have this procession. They plan this procession. And they're, marching through the streets and they're singing hymns and they have this icon. They're marching with it. And Francis is out there and he's, wants to see the procession. And as he sees this icon of the Blessed Virgin, he kind of locks eyes with it. And he said the gaze just seemed to like pierce his heart. And he hears this voice, an inner voice, which, locution, what they would call it, a voice from heaven that no one else hears. He just hears it internally. And it's Mary admonishing him. She's saying, why? Thou art not made for this world. What art thou doing in the world? Hasten, become a religious. And he falls to his knees after hearing this. He knows he's promised, he's made these promises and not fulfilled them again and again. And the crowd passes and he's just still on his knees. They're just crying. And at this point, this is the final thing for him. He's now I have to do this, he's given this final message. So he goes off and his father kind of makes fun of him. You're not going to do this. You like nice clothes and fancy stuff. There's no way you're going to do this. And his father enlists some of the relatives to help try to dissuade him. And he won't have it. He goes off and joins the Passionist order. When he was 18 years old. 2 days later, they give him the habit, the outfit of the Passionists, the robe and so forth. And he gets a new name, Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows, because of his devotion to the Virgin Mary. And a year later, he says his vows. He's in the order. And he's basically known as this excellent student, and like everyone's really impressed by everything. But very shortly thereafter, he gets tuberculosis, and kind of accepts it this time. He doesn't bargain, say, "Oh, please heal me, and I'll do this, this, and this." He just kind of accepts his fate, and it ends up taking his life. But the other people in his order are so impressed by the way he just sort of accepts this and becomes this example for him, that they said, even though he's potentially contagious, just everybody wanted to be with him, that he just accepted it with such grace and so forth. So he has a vision of what they assume was Mary at the end of his life, because he kind of sits up and reaches for something and then pretty much falls back dead. And he has a spiritual advisor who basically made this comment: consumed by the ardor of divine love rather than by the violence of disease, comforted and wrapped in ecstasy by the apparition of his heavenly mother, whom he loved with an immeasurable affection, he was sweetly received by her and laden with merits left for heaven. So I guess they're assuming that's what he saw. I don't think he had the ability at the last moments of his life to say, "Oh, I'm seeing Mary," or anything. But I guess that's kind of what they assume he saw. The interesting thing is he didn't have any miracles in his life. He didn't cure anybody. He didn't do anything. He didn't have a lot of contact with people, but it's all of his miracles occur after he's died. So these are all people that go to him or go to his tomb and appeal to him. They're praying for his intercession, and some of them are given some of his relics, and he's cured a number of people. Like I said, somebody was cured of deafness by sprinkling some of his grave dust in his ear. People were cured of blindness from like touching his tomb with a handkerchief and rubbing their eyes. Hernias, he cured a lot of people's hernias. He's the guy to pray to if you have a hernia. So, just the number of people. I think in the episode, I did about half of the ones they had in the book I was reading. I mean, it's just got to be too many because the whole episode couldn't be just me listing off people he had cured. But he just a lot of people were cured miraculously by his intercession, and that's what led, I think, to his becoming a saint.
So yeah, the miracles were first, and then the posthumous kind of miracles were first.
Yeah. I would say, and a lot of people would attest to that, including. So he wasn't a saint. He wasn't even. He might have been beatified by the time Saint Gemma Galgani came along. But he wasn't a saint for sure, and she was reading about him, and he showed up and performed a miracle in her life, which leads us to Saint Gemma.
There's an interesting aspect to hers, the demonic oppression.
Yeah.
That is a part of it, and the demonic apparitions and all this. Listening to this last night, I was very much reminded of Annalise Michel. That case is the one that Exorcism of Emily Rose was based off of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A similar, people that claim that they've had healings at her grave and these type of things. I've heard this. There's a veneration there as well.
Yeah, there's this theory that the closer you get to God, the more the devil's going to torment you. And I don't know if this is true in all cases, but if we take her story, and the way I pieced together her story was from about 3 or 4 different sources. One of them was from her spiritual advisor, Father Germanus. There was another biography written about her by, another priest named Father Amadeo, called Blessed Gemma Galgani. So again, that was written before she was canonized as a saint. She wrote an autobiography. Some of it was taken from that, and some was taken from some later biographies of her. So I pieced together, the what I felt was the most interesting parts of her life from these various biographies. And if we are to believe this, it's certainly held up that she was blessed with these wonderful apparitions, but she was also tormented, like really tormented, like physically tormented by this demonic stuff. There's other books that have been written about her that basically said she was a manipulative, kind of a crazy person. I think it would be easy to say that about a lot of people who've experienced paranormal things. And in fact, people have said that about people who've experienced paranormal things. Any number of people have had hauntings and so forth. People said, oh, well, they're crazy, or they're manipulating people. They want attention. These are all things I've heard about strange familiars guests, right? So I tend to think of her as, yeah, she was likely imperfect. She wasn't, she was a human. So, I'm sure she had some imperfections, but I look at her life as a whole, and you get to see a pretty incredible picture. And it's like people say with, if any part of it is true, we have a massive miracle, much less if you take her life as a whole. And she had a really, really incredible life. She's born in Lucca, Italy in 1878. She's got a very short life, by the way. She lived to 20 or 21, I think, in her early 20s. Her mother dies when she's very young. Her mother was kind of responsible for her spiritual upbringing. She hears a voice during Mass. That's her first locution and she gets a voice that she said she described it as a voice in her heart, which asked her, so, "Will you give me your mama?" And she said, "Yes, if you take me also." And the voice answered, said, "No, you must give unreservedly your mother. You have to wait with your father. I'll take you to heaven later." And she supposedly gave a resigned yes. Her mother dies a few months later of tuberculosis. So this is this kind of like sad beginning of her life. And part of me, like reading her as a human being, like just looking at her as a human, it seems like she has this longing to get back to her mother from this point on. And she knows her way to get back to her mother is to go to heaven, right? She assumes her mother's in heaven. So she decides, from a very young age, she starts asking the Virgin Mary, like, make me a saint. Because, just on a psychological level, to me, it seems like she's just trying to get back to her mother, right? Her mother made such a huge impression on her. And she says she never really connected with anybody else in her family the way she connected with her mom. So I think, if you want to remove religion and talk about psychology, I think that might be a factor in her life. But she tries to live this very pious life from a very young age. She's very attentive to religion. And as a young person, she's, it's pretty amazing. She gets these sicknesses. She gets a foot infection at one point, and she's bedridden for months and surgery's required. And this is something that's in her autobiography, but I just didn't get into it too much. It just didn't kind of interrupt the flow of the podcast. But she was very upset at the idea that anyone would have to look at her unclothed body or to touch her unclothed body. She was very, very worried about that. So she would go with these injuries and these infections and stuff and just not tell anybody for a really, really long time till they get really bad. And I think that happened with this whatever foot injury she had. She had an infection. Eventually they said, you have to have surgery. She doesn't want to be put under in any way, whatever form of anesthesia they had at the time, which I think wasn't much, but she wanted to be in control of her body the whole time. She wanted to keep and kind of guard over her own body. So she goes into these surgeries without anesthesia. And they said she would just like focus on the crucifix. And then they said she'd just bear the pain. They said she'd moan a little bit. That's all you'd hear from her. They're actually doing surgery on her. She heals. She's kind of bouncing around from her aunts back to her father's house and so forth. Her father loves her. Her father just pours attention on her and gives her these gifts. And her whole family kind of really wants her to be this like regular kid, like, go out and have fun, be a kid. And she's very serious about religion. She only wants to really go to mass and pray and so forth. But her father, showers her with gifts. He's fairly wealthy. And at one point he gives her a gold watch and chain, and she's, walking around very proudly displaying this chain. And she comes home and she sees her guardian angel, who she saw on multiple occasions. A number of saints can end up seeing their guardian angels, which is very interesting. Padre Pio, if you know who he is, he's a later saint. I think he died in the 60s. He was able to see and talk to his guardian angel, and in fact, see other people's guardian angels who would bring him messages. So this is very interesting that Saint Gemma had this as well.
Do they name these guardian angels, or do they just say this is the guardian angel? There's not a specific...
You're not supposed to name your guardian angel. There is... except for there's some, we'll get into this in the Christmas show on Strange Familiars. We'll talk about this because we're doing it on angels. But the way I understand it is you are not supposed to name your angels, because that's an occultism thing. Like when you name something, you have power over it. And even in the Bible, when there's certain passages in the Bible where these angels appear and people are like, "Oh, tell us who you are so we can worship you." And the angels are like, "No, like, why are you asking for my name? No. That's not it. It's not about me," kind of thing. So, and this is something I learned very recently. So you're not really supposed to name your guardian angel. You're not supposed to ask them their name. And this has to do with demons as well, because they can take the form of these miraculous, wonderful looking things. And once they realize that there's names involved and stuff, and that you can get into trickery. There's a whole thing with it. So no, she did not know her guardian angel's name. and she referred to him only as her guardian angel. So anyway, she returns home. She sees her guardian angel as she's taking this jewelry off, and he kind of admonishes her. And he says, "Remember, the precious jewelry that adorns the spouse of a crucified king can only be thorns in the cross." And at that point, she takes off the jewelry, she puts it away, and never puts it on again. She would only wear very, very simple plain wool garments from then on. She took this very, very seriously from a very young age, which is interesting. Like, when you want to just say, "Oh, she was just crazy," well, she is devoted to this from a young age. She starts getting these apparitions and locutions frequently. They come to her like once after Holy Communion. She has this conversation with Jesus. He says, "Well, like, why didn't you take me to paradise again?" I think she has this longing to go where her mother went. And he says, "I will give thee many occasions of greater merit in this life through the increased longing for heaven, while bearing patiently the pains on earth." Her father dies. These creditors come and basically take everything the family owned. So she's kind of moves in with a wealthy aunt for a while. While there, this is in another town called Camaiore in Italy. One of the wealthiest families in the area, one of their sons becomes interested in her and like proposes marriage, and she wants nothing to do with that. And she just leaves. She just I'm out of here. She doesn't want any trouble with this guy or with her aunt, any pressure from her to marry this guy. So she returns to her father's house, and she's afflicted at this point with this really wicked illness. I'll read a passage. This is from Father Germanus' book called The Life of Saint Gemma Galgani. "This child of heaven began to feel worse, developing a curvature of the spine. An alarming attack of meningitis set in, together with a total loss of hearing. Large abscesses formed in her head, one of which seemed to make its way down through her chest and settled in her side. Then her hair fell off. Finally, her limbs became paralyzed. A consultation of learned medical men was held, and from the first it became evident that hers was a very serious case of spine disease and probably incurable." They cauterized her spine at some point. Again, she took no anesthesia for this, such as was available, at the time. All of these remedies failed, and she just suffered for a really, really long period of time. She was 20 years old at this point. Throughout her illness, she's still getting these apparitions, her guardian angels talking to her, saying, if Jesus afflicts thee corporally, in other words, in your body, he does it to purify you more and more, so be good. And then the devil starts appearing to her, and he says, in these various forms. I think they say he appears as like a black monkey, as a giant, as a furious man. For someone who writes books on Bigfoot, all of these things are going on.
Yeah, the black monkey thing is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going. Boy, why didn't I knew this information when I was writing Where the Footprints End? But in any case, that she's tempted. The devil's saying, like, just follow me, and I'll heal you, but I'll give you your every desire. And she says no, refuses him or whatever. And at one point, she's given this biography of Saint Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. The same one I used actually for a source for my episode. Not the actual book, but the same text. And she said she didn't care to read it at first. She kind of said it there, and she's like, it just didn't hum for her, I guess, at the time. But then she started reading his biography, and she felt closer and closer to him. He is a very attractive saint in as much as like his story is very accessible, I think. And I think she feels resonance with him. And she begins to sleep with his picture under her pillow. And then she starts to see him in visions. And he says, I don't know how to explain it, but I feel his presence near me, like at all times during this sickness. January 4th, 1899, her doctors made one last attempt to save her life. Surgery was performed on the abscess in her side. Her spine was cauterized. She again refuses to take anesthesia. I can't imagine that kind of pain. I woke up in the middle of surgery one time and it was ridiculous. And it was just hernia surgery. It was not spine surgery.
I'm trying to imagine what cauterizing a spine would even look like, or I don't even. What are they trying to do? I don't even.
Or just maybe kill these abscesses that are moving up and down our spine. I don't know what they're doing. Whatever it is, it sounds any medical procedure in the 1890s was horrifying.
What was anesthetic? Probably ether. I mean, it's probably what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, but even that, she refuses this. So the operation only seemed to make it worse, as you can imagine. I don't know if what was that show? You ever watched the Nick? I think it was called. Was it based on the Knickerbocker Hospital in New York I think it was in the 1890s or early 1900s.
Yeah, I never watched these medical. I know what you're talking about it. Yeah, they're
horrifying, like just horrifying medical procedures at the time. Anyway, one of her visitors begs her to make a novena, which is this would be a devotion over 9 days. So a novena is like a 9-day prayer cycle. So you repeat this sort of prayer cycle to Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, and she begins this novena, and she's kind of like, all right, I'll give it a try. Her heart really wasn't in it, but then Saint Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows appears to her and says, do you want to recover? And she says, I'm gonna appear to you every night, and we're gonna pray this novena together. So he comes to her, and every night they pray this. On the 9th day, she hears the voice of Jesus again, says, do you wish to recover? She's too weak to reply. And she said that she answers in her heart. She answered, whatever you will. At 2:00 in the afternoon on March 3rd, so it's precisely 9 days, the novena lasts. She finishes the novena, 2:00 in the afternoon. I think it's the following day. She gets up out of bed fully healed. So there were a ton of people. There were people coming to visit her, to see her, because they couldn't believe this young woman was facing this horrible sickness with such bravery and stuff. She's healed. She's completely healed. She gets up and healed. There's servants, her family's around. Everyone's just like, what is going on? So it's pretty interesting. There's a lot of witnesses to this miraculous healing, and she credits Saint Gabriel, or at least his intercession, for that. After this, however, it seems like these apparitions just start coming hard and fast, one after another. She would often see and speak to her guardian angel, but now she starts going into these ecstatic states. They could occur anywhere. She could be walking down the street, and I don't know if so. Ecstatic states is like these visionaries will fall into this almost like hypnotic state. There are films of some of the more modern seers and stuff that go into these ecstatic states, and so you can imagine by looking at these films, it was the same thing. They will poke these people with pins, they'll burn them with matches. They do not react. They are in another place. They will pick them up and drop them really hard on the ground. They were kind of really rough with these seers, and they do not react. They're in another place when they're in these ecstatic states. It's very, very interesting. So she would go into these ecstatic states anywhere, at any time. She would fall into it in the middle of a conversation, walking down the street. She just anywhere she'd go into these ecstatic states. Even she was given communion during some of these visions, which again some of these other seers have reported doing. At Fatima, the seers took communion from an angel. Excuse me, get a drink of water. So she would take communion. They'd see her kneel and clasp her hands, put out her tongue, and then withdraw it. And they asked her at some point, who's giving you communion? She said it was an apparition of Jesus that was actually giving her communion. She experienced ecstatic levitation. Again, this is something that you find in various saints, and again, some of these modern visionaries.
And people have witnessed. Did people witness the levitation? Actually see her levitate?
Gemma, I don't think anybody witnessed her, but some of these modern ones, right. Crowds of people have witnessed levitation. She levitated 2 times, I believe. Both times she was there was this life-size crucifix, they said, in their home, and she was just obsessed with the blood of Jesus. She's just very, very obsessed with it, and she would want to kiss Jesus's wounds, and she would be sort of lifted up, supernaturally lifted up, so she could kiss these wounds. And at one time, the Christ on the cross kind of comes alive and reaches out to her, and she's drinking the blood from his side, which is, it's pretty bloody stuff. Hers is a pretty bloody story, and all in all.
Yeah, there's a lot of stigmata involved here.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. So soon after this, she gets this vision of Jesus, where instead of blood's coming from his wounds, there's fire coming from his wounds, and she feels burning in her wrists, burning in her side, burning in her feet, and she comes out of this ecstatic state with stigmata, with the wounds of Christ. They're bleeding profusely. She would get it repeatedly. She would get these on Thursday. They would start at Thursday evening. They would continue till 3 p.m. on Friday. And then they would start to heal up. By Saturday or Sunday, every week, the wounds were healed. So I don't know how someone so we could fake this with modern special effects, but I don't know how someone in the 1800s fakes this.
Well, isn't that in line too with Jesus is arrested on the Thursday, the Passion starts on that time, he is crucified at 3 p.m. on Friday, I guess according to the tradition, that this is, that's in line with the suffering of Christ.
Yeah.
And then
So
Saturday he's in the grave, and so it slowly stops. Yeah.
Reenacting his passion like every week, essentially. And they said there was so much blood, like just people were like, the people who lived with her were freaking out. Like, where is all this blood coming from? Now her family weren't 100% with this. Like after a time, they're like, okay, enough, stop messing around, stop this. And her aunts, her parents are both dead at this point. Her aunts, who she's living with, are like threatening her. It's like, you show me where this blood is coming from. Show me how you're faking this. They're not convinced at all. And they're having the servants follow her around and, try to figure out how she's doing this. So even her whole family is trying to out her. They're trying to figure out how she's doing this. She, if she's able to pull this off, a lot of people will look at these saints and stuff and say, well, you could do that with sleight of hand, and you could do that with this, this, and this. Well, okay, but this is 1899. This is, a girl in Italy. She didn't have access to YouTube. How is she learning, this master sleight of hand coupled with Hollywood special effects in order to do this? It just seems a lot, especially when everybody in her house, everybody she's living with is trying to find her out. They're trying to figure out how she's doing this. They don't believe her. The example I use is like when Jesus says a prophet is not without honor except in his native place, in his own house. Familiarity breeds contempt. It's the idea that the people around you are they're not ready for this. They're not going to believe that, in Jesus' hometown, he was just a carpenter. Like, what? This guy's doing what? He's the carpenter's son.
Yeah, nothing good can come from Nazareth.
Yeah.
Right.
So they're trying to find her out, but she's nobody can find her out, and they have people come and investigate these wounds. There's a Passionist priest named Father Cachetan who came, and he said, this is a testimony. He said, I, the undersigned, hereby testify and declare that in July 1899, I saw certain extraordinary wounds on the hands of the young girl, Gemma Galgani. In the inside, that is in the palms, there was seen a raised piece of flesh like the head of a nail, about as large as a halfpenny. At the back of each hand, there was somewhat deep laceration that seemed to have been caused by by a blunt nail forced through the hand from the opposite side. I and those with me had no hesitation in saying that those were the stigmata, which could not have come from any natural cause. In fact, we saw our hands on Thursday, free from any marks. On Friday morning, we found them as we have described. We examined them again on Saturday and found no mark except a small reddish cicatrix, which is like a little scar, a little mark. On other occasions, she would sweat blood. She would cry blood. Her clothes, they said, would just be completely soaked with blood. They said eventually she starts manifesting the wounds of the scourging. So she has bleeding stripes, and then the next week they're deeper. And they said that by the third week, They said you could almost see the bones beneath her flesh. They're so deep. And again, these would heal. These would heal without infection. By Sunday, they'd be healed. So eventually, I think her spiritual advisor's like, you should pray to maybe have the stigmata stop, because it's like a lot. Like people don't know what to do with you. They were just like bleeding through her bedclothes constantly. And so she does pray, and it does stop. But then she would spit up blood then, and she said like it was as if she had to give this blood up one way or another. And she would issue great quantities of blood from her mouth. They said like just at the point where people were like, oh my God, like how is this person alive? And she, that's that. She said, I cannot give thee blood from other parts of my body. I give it to thee from my heart. So they looked at her heart after she died. It was swollen. It was really weird. They said it was like wider than it was long. It looked like it had been flattened out. And in life, they said her heart beat so hard and violently, it looked like it pushed out some of her ribs. 3 of her ribs on her left side were almost at a right angle, pushed out. So something really weird was going on with her heart.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So this goes on. She ends up moving out from her family. Her family relationship becomes very contentious. She ends up moving in with another family who sort of adopts her as their daughter. The Giannini family continues to have these different, apparitions and stuff. At one point, Father Germanus, he's trying to get her to write down her life story, and he knows she's too humble. She's not going to do it. So he says, I want you to write a full confession of your life's sins. And he knows she'll do that. Because she thought, it's so funny if you read her biography, she thinks she's this horrible sinner, like this, you can't imagine, like, and her sin is like, I was mean to a guy once, it's like, I was rude to a person. And she thinks she's like this awful sinner in her own writing. So she's writing about, what a horrible sinner she is. And she finishes this manuscript. She gives it to Mother Giannini, rather, the woman she's living with. She puts it in a drawer. A few days later, she sees this, what she described as a chuckling demon, crawl through the window, and then in the room in which her biography was stored in this drawer, and then he disappears. And the same entity appears to her a short time later and says, "War, war, thy book is in my hands." And they check the drawer where they had put it, and it's gone. The book is missing. They write a letter to Father Germanus, and he decides he's 400 miles away in another town in Italy, and he decides, well, I'm going to perform an exorcism and just see what happens. He does this. Afterwards, the book is found once again in the drawer where they had left it, but the pages are singed all the way around, and they're like blackened with smoke. You can see this book, by the way, if you go online. This book exists, and it's the book that has passed through hellfire, they say. So it was brought back to her, so you can actually see pictures of it. There's film of it. There's at least one YouTube story of her life kind of thing where they actually film the book. You kind of see them. They turn a few pages. You can actually see it. It's pretty interesting. But she is tormented by these demons. They appear to her at one time in the middle of winter, and says like, this demon says, I'm going to get you no matter what. Like, you're going to give in to me. And she runs and like jumps into the freezing water in the garden. Somebody, they say that like some kind of hand reached in and pulled her out, like presumably a hand from heaven or something. But she would be writing, and she'd have the pen snatched from her hand. So these demonic entities would tear up the paper. They would drag her around by her hair, like tearing her hair out of the scalp. She'd be beaten, bitten, like kicked to the ground, clawed. And they said these would sometimes last all night. Like, you could hear her just being beaten all night long by these things. The priest, Father Germanus, did see in the form of a black cat one day. It came into the room while he was there, and he sees this big black cat come in and like start hissing at her, standing at the edge of her bed, and he's like completely freaked out. And she just said to him calmly, "Don't be afraid. It's that demon who wants to annoy me, but don't fear. He won't do you any harm." The priest said he sprinkles holy water and the thing just disappears. So, more than her witnessed these things. So she was absolutely brutalized by these demonic entities. So at one point towards the end of her life, she does ask for an exorcism. She feels like she's possessed because this is happening so much. She wants to join. She wants to become a nun. She wants to join the Passionist order once she learns of Saint Gabriel and learns he's a Passionist. I think she becomes like she's like that. Those are my people. So she applies to a Passionist convent, and she's got pretty bad health. She's had all these bad health conditions, and this reputation as a mystic precedes her. And the Mother Superior was like, nah, which you can understand. That might be kind of a distraction for other people in the community. So even though Father Germanus and her confessor and these other people are writing letters like, please take her, this Mother Superior is like, nah, I don't think she's a good fit. So she basically begins to live as a nun, like outside of the cloister. She takes the same vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. She wears the Passionist symbol underneath her clothes. She recites what they call the divine office, the prayers, daily. Just as the Passionist nuns did, and she prays that the order will set up a convent in Lucca where she lives, with hopes that like maybe if there's one in her hometown she can join. But she gets this final illness, it becomes pretty clear that she's not going to recover from this, and she actually says, "The Passionists will not receive me on earth. For all I wish to be with them, but I will be so when I'm dead." Jesus has the habit of a Passionist nun waiting for me at the gates of heaven. She is completely accepted as a Passionist now. Like the order kind of embraced her as one of their own. So she was kind of right. After death, she is absolutely accepted as a Passionist. Her last sickness just lasts 9 months. She couldn't taste food. She's got pains. She's stuck in bed. She would still get into these ecstatic states. One time a priest comes to bring her communion. The priest is like, what should I do? Because Father Germanus is there. He's like, give her communion. She'll do the right thing. And she's like in this ecstatic state. The priest brings over communion. She snaps out of the ecstatic state, takes communion, boom, right back into her ecstatic state. So it must have been pretty amazing to watch. She gets, again, she's having these heavenly visions, but also these demonic visions at the same time that are coming. And it's just, sounds like absolute torture. She's sick already. She's in bed, and the people that were caring for her. There's a quote I'm trying to find. So one of the nurses and attendants was talking about these assaults, and she said the abominable beast will be the end of her. Deafening blows, forms of ferocious animals. I came away from her in tears because the demon is wearing her out. There's no remedy for it. So they said her food would, even when she could eat, like her food right before her eyes would turn into the disgusting, like just covered with disgusting insects and stuff, and make it look disgusting. So she's 9 months. She finds that she is in her final sickness, and about 5 days before her death, she manifests this supernatural weight. Now at this point, she is literally skin and bones. She's not been able to eat much at all. She couldn't be lifted by a single person. They said it took 3 workmen in unison to move her. So she develops this supernatural weight, which you hear again with some of these modern visionaries, some of these Marian apparitions. They will be little girls like age 10, and grown men can't pick them up. They'll have grown men come and like try to lift them. In fact, one of the girls' fathers, there was a guy who came to Garabandal, and he was kind of a doubter. And one of the girl's fathers like, go ahead, try to lift her up. This is a grown man and a 10-year-old girl. And this guy goes over and tries to lift her. He cannot budge her. It can't be lifted off the ground. It's amazing. And yet the other visionaries, these other girls, could lift each other easily. They would pick each other up easily to lift each other, because they would lift each other up to hold these items for the apparition to kiss. So this supernatural weight is a thing that happens. It's a real thing.
Isn't that in Fatima too? Isn't that part of somewhere?
It might be. It might be. You'd think having just done that, you'd think I know, but it comes up. It comes up. It's a really, really interesting thing. So Saint Gemma manifests this supernatural weight towards the end of her life. And eventually, Good Friday of 1903, however appropriate that is, she enters into her final ecstasy. They said her arms are outstretched as if she's nailed to a cross, and this ecstasy lasts until the following day. They basically know she's going to die. They call a priest in. She's given the last rites, and then 1 p.m. Holy Saturday, so 1 p.m. the next day, she dies. They said those who observed her said, like she was totally peaceful looking, and she had asked that she would be able to die on a great feast day. So the nuns who attended Gemma in her last days commented, "We've managed a great many of sick people, but never have we seen anything like this." So she left quite an impression on those around her. They said she looked beautiful. She didn't look like she was dead. She was already basically being hailed as a saint. People were coming to her and at her dead body and touching stuff to her body to make relics. They said that the nuns had to basically guard her hair. So many people wanted pieces of her hair. They said she would have been bald. They would have just taken her hair completely off.
And she's so modern that there's a few photographs.
Oh yeah. There's I think 5 or so photographs of her. You can see actual photographs of her, and you can get actual relics. Actual pieces of her body are out there. They're not cheap, but if you want them, you can find them. Actual pieces of her hair. And
is the trading of relics like that sanctioned by the church, or is that a no-no?
You are not supposed to sell them.
Yeah,
you're allowed to give them away, but people get around it by saying like, well, you're buying this rosary, and with it, I'm going to give you this relic. So that's how people get around it. So they will sell you a rosary for $1,500, and with it, you will get a relic of Gemma. That's how they get around that.
And pieces of people's corpses.
It could be the hair, teeth. In fact, at one point, Gemma was given a tooth of St. Gabriel of Our Lady of Sorrows. She had one of his teeth. So she's buried, and then 14 days later, I believe it was, let's see. Yeah, 14 days later, she's exhumed for autopsy. They remove her, and they said, no, this is only 14 days, but they said she's completely fresh, completely incorrupt. This is, not a time where they were using formaldehyde or anything. They were just putting people in a wooden box in the ground. But they took out her heart, and it was, when they were cutting into it, they said the blood was completely fresh looking blood. It's like should not be in a corpse that's 14 days old. And they said her heart was, trying to find the quote, it was misshapen, flattened, and stretched. It appeared wider than it was long. So something was odd was going on with her heart. All the doctors in attendance to the autopsy were completely astonished by the condition of her blood. She's reburied. 5 years later, she's exhumed again. She's going to move her to what they determined to be a more suitable resting place for her. Her brother Guido's there. She was buried with flowers. And I don't know the condition of her body at the time. So incorruptibility, is another thing with saints. You'll find that not all of them, but some of them don't rot the way other corpses do. In fact, they don't behave at all like corpses should. They don't smell bad. They smell good. They don't rot. They remain very lifelike. Some of them will, cry sometimes. So they don't cause disease and cause sickness. They heal people. So they almost do, again, here we have this opposite thing. They sort of do the opposite of what other corpses do. But in any case, they don't mention the condition of her body if it was still incorrupt, but they did take the flowers out that she was buried with. And they said the flowers were completely as fresh as the day they were buried. That was like a half a decade earlier. So that's pretty interesting stuff, given that they were in the ground for 5 years. But she's credited with numerous physical cures, incurable synovitis, stomach cancer, various tumors, meningitis, tubercular peritonitis, and nephritis. I'm not sure what that is. A monk. She's the patron saint for back pain. So she's a good one if you have back pain. There's a Chalmodesian monk that had devastating back pain, could barely move, and he was cured. Stomach ulcers and appendicitis. So there it is. There's even a modern account of her, which I didn't put in the podcast, where it was I believe it was a Palestinian who had to get like through the checkpoint in Israel, and he didn't know how he was going to do it. I don't know if he didn't have his papers or what. He was I believe he was a Palestinian Christian, and he had talked to a a, a priest, I think, who was very sort of devoted to Saint Gemma. And I might have some of these details wrong, but this is the gist of the story. Essentially, this priest is telling him about Saint Gemma, and then he's very, very worried about crossing this checkpoint. Like he doesn't know how he's going to get back and forth. And this woman gets in the car, this young woman with dark hair, and she says, "Just ride with me." And they go right through the checkpoint. They're not even stopped. And he asks her his name, and she says, "Oh, I'm, your priest's friend, Gemma." That's all she says. And he gets out of the car and goes on his way. So there's this kind of very modern, this very recent modern story of her, appearing and helping this fellow get through this problematic situation. So yeah, she's really interesting, very visceral, kind of very bloody story, very, very appealing to those who like a lot of action in their saints, a lot of fights with demons and a lot of blood and stuff.
Yeah, there was one thing where she went into, I think you said that she went into a church and there was the priest, and the priest ended up being a demon, or he was posing as a priest or something.
Yeah, she went to confession, and she says she found it odd because I guess she was waiting for confession, didn't see a priest go into the confessional, but all of a sudden there's a priest there. But she's thinking, well, I must not have seen him go into the confessional. She goes in and starts giving confession, and she says, by the voice, she recognizes this guy, and it seems to be this priest that she knew, that she'd had confession with before. And then all of a sudden he starts using very vile language and gestures and so forth, and she gets very flustered. She was known to be very affected, like somebody supposedly at dinner one night used the Lord's name in vain, or in a curse word or something, and she like literally fainted. Like she was that sensitive to that kind of stuff. So I can't imagine, if this what she thought was a priest was saying these vile things, like how much that affected her. She leaves the confessional and like sort of turns around to glance, and then realizes it's empty. So whatever was in there just disappeared. Which again, Saint Padre Pio had a very similar thing where he had someone come into the confessional. He was a priest, so he was hearing confession, and he had some a demon or the devil or some kind of dark entity come into the confessional for him. So it's sort of a very similar episode.
We're looking at something here, Tim, and we're running out of time, but talking about the concept of the victim soul.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't get into that on the podcast, but yeah, she's very much considered sort of the victim soul, and that is a person who takes on this sickness and this pain in life, sort of for the conversion of others and for other people's souls. It's a very it's considered a very sort of honorable calling, if you are a victim soul. But yeah, she absolutely would be considered that.
Well, this is all very fascinating stuff, Tim. What are some of the saints that are coming up that you're going to talk about? Do you have that kind of mapped out?
Yeah, so I'm doing the cephalophores, like I said, the headless saints. That'll be a whole group of them in one episode. It won't be all of them, but it'll be a lot of them. Saint Denis is the most popular one, but there's a bunch of others. I won't get into their stories because you'll hear them all. Saint Edmund's another cool one. Ends up being the patron saint of wolves because a wolf guards his head. His head's cut off by Vikings, and they throw it in the woods, and this wolf guards it for several days. So he ends up being the patron saint of wolves. But a lot of cool stories about people getting their head cut off and still preaching and stuff. So that's coming up, and I'm gonna do. So it's not going to be all saints. It'll be some mystics and stuff, and some other interesting sort of side roads. So I'm going to do a show on the poor souls. So these are the souls in purgatory that have come in and appeared to people, various people, saints and mystics and so forth. So I'm going to do a show on that coming up. And then Saint Elizabeth Seton, she is the first saint that was ever born in America. So that will be coming up. And then I'll probably dig in deep to these medieval saints, because I just bought a bunch of really cool books that are translations of these old manuscripts of the lives of these medieval saints. So there'll probably be a lot of them as well.
All right. Well, excellent, Tim. What's next for you? In books coming on the pike, or?
So the Hermit book will be next. As slow as it's coming along, I'm writing a book on hermits. That's, all the hermits you've heard on Strange Familiars, and then some beyond that, a lot more beyond that, really. So that book is ever growing because I keep finding more hermits. So it's neat. You'll get to see each one of these hermits I'm writing about, because I've collected photos of them. So it's, I pull out a photo and I write their story as much as I can find, and then but problem is I keep finding more photos and more hermits. But hopefully I meant to have that out in 2022, but it's not going to happen. So hopefully 2023 is the year for the hermit book. After that, who knows book wise? There's definitely more of the historical Bigfoot books coming. The research is done. I just need to put together the books. East Coast will be next. So I'll do East Coast Wild Men, which will be the entire East Coast. That should be a pretty thick book. And then after that, I don't know how to break down the country. Like I need to figure out where does the Midwest end and the West begin?
That's a philosophical question there.
Yeah, exactly. Where does the South end and the Southwest begin? These are, it's like a lot of times you get like, well, in the middle of Texas. Well, that doesn't help me. It's not like I have to figure out how to do these different regions. But eventually I'll do the whole country with the historical Bigfoot stuff. So but the next one will be the East Coast. And then who knows, there's some talk with Josh about some projects we're working on together.
Yeah, he told me some stuff. Yeah.
And Strange Familiars is going. We are in the cool weather time, so lots of on-site shows coming up for that, which are some of my favorites to do. I love going to these spooky places and doing the shows there. So expect a lot of that from Strange Familiars coming up, and then of course more of the same. Where I'm interviewing people all the time and knocking shows out every week.
And if people have not heard of Strange Familiars and know where to get your books, where can they find them?
So strangefamiliars.com has links to me and all my books, and all that contact information goes to me. Please like and subscribe everywhere. And the Flowered Path is thefloweredpath.com. Please, that's a very budding podcast. If you can subscribe wherever you listen to that would help me a great deal. I'm trying to get the word out about that, trying to get that established. It's a new venture for sure. So, and there's a YouTube channel as well. It's all separate from Strange Familiar. So if you could subscribe to both of them, that would be a great help.
Okay, excellent. Well, and guys, of course, Conspirinormal.com, and we have a YouTube channel as well. You guys can find us there too. Give that a subscription, and we also have a Patreon too. And Sergio can tell you where you can find that.
You can find that at patreon.com/Conspirinormal. We've been getting back into posting regular Patreon episodes, so hope you guys enjoy that. And coming up here at the beginning of the year, we should resume the monthly Strange Reality streaming presentations for the $10 and up level patrons.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. And next week, we're actually going to talk about the history of the Bible. So this is going to be an interesting lead into that. So, all right, stay on the line for us, Tim. We're going to close out the show, and we'll see you next time.